We're here today with Professor Robert P. George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence here at Princeton University. Today, in Christianity and in wider society, there's much talk of justice. What does Jesus' justice look like, and how are we to live it out?
Sometimes in our modern discourse, especially in our post-Enlightenment discourse, we reduce justice to a concept of rights where rights are considered in a very individualistic mode. This has caused some critics of what's called rights talk to reject the very idea of rights, to claim that speaking in terms of rights is a kind of capitulation to the modern cult of the imperial self. It encourages selfishness, self-regard, self-interest in the narrow sense, a sense in which, of course, it would be utterly incompatible with Christian teaching. So when Jesus speaks about justice, when the prophets speak about justice, they are not speaking of some narrow individual rights conception of justice. While we must honor the rights of all persons, we must do more than that. We must seek to establish terms of interaction and cooperation in which all the members of the community who are affected by our decisions can flourish. Really, the ultimate goal is the flourishing of the human being, the flourishing of the human person in all the diverse aspects of our personality and being. And as I say, ultimately, because we are not merely material, but are also spiritual beings.
You mentioned the prophets, and of course we have ringing in our ears. The prophets protest against idolatry, against the oppression of the worker, of the sojourner, of the widow and the orphan, and ultimately against rebellion against the God of Israel. How does that translate into America and this year and the coming decade?
Idolatry is always a temptation. It's a perennial temptation. It's not something that Judaism wiped out or that Christianity has cured. There is always the temptation for all of us at all times to place something less than God in the place of God and to effectively worship that something. That doesn't mean, kneeling down or bowing down before a golden calf or a stone outcropping or a painted totem pole. Yes, we can avoid that easily enough in this day and age. But do we worship money? Do we worship power? Do we worship comfort? Do we worship status, prestige? All of these things, which are not bad in themselves, become very bad, soul imperiling, potentially soul destroying when they are put in the place of God, when effectually we are worshiping those things rather than God himself. No matter how good the goal is, even the goal of relieving world poverty or healing the damaged environment or defending people's fundamental human rights, if it's approached in the wrong way, can become idolatry. We have to worry about more than simply the temptation to do bad things. We have to avoid the temptation to do good things for bad reasons or in bad ways, ways that are not in line with the will of God and our understanding of ourselves and our fellow human beings as creatures made in the very image and likeness of God, and to be loved precisely as such. Think about the prophets. Jesus told us something about the prophets. Do you remember when he said, when you went out into the desert to see John the Baptist, who did you go to see? A prophet? And Jesus says, I tell you, yes, he's a prophet and more than a prophet. That tells us something very, very important. John was not a political figure. He was not someone who was working to establish a more just regime of economic relations or of politics. He was someone who was calling everyone to repentance, calling everyone to turn away from sin and to turn back from God. And he had very concrete understandings of what sin was. It wasn't something abstract. And we know this from the circumstances of his martyrdom. John, this man whom Jesus himself tells us was not only a prophet, but more than a prophet, ended up giving his life because he railed against the illicit marriage of Herod, the corruption of the institution of marriage by a political leader whose job was to serve the common good and not to undermine it. It would have been very easy, of course, very safe for this great prophet and more than a prophet to say nothing about the private life, one might say, of the king. And yet John would not keep his mouth shut because he was a prophet and more than a prophet, understanding the importance of the institution of marriage to the flourishing of human beings, thus to the common good, thus to the very concept of justice. He had to speak, and his witness cost him his life.
Why does marriage matter? Why is marriage a justice issue? Why is it a social justice issue?
If justice is ultimately about willing the flourishing of ourselves and others, willing the flourishing of human beings, if social justice is about the flourishing of human beings in society, then what could be more fundamental to justice than marriage for this reason? Marriage is the original and best Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. It plays an indispensable role in forming each new generation, in providing children with the structure, the nurturing, the education that enables them to become flourishing human beings who will be contributors to the flourishing of the society as a whole, who will respect themselves and respect others, who will order their own lives according to virtues like honesty, integrity, conscientiousness, the willingness to work hard, to defer gratification, to respect the property of others, respect the lives of others. All these virtues that are indispensable in any society, that all institutions of society depend on, the legal system, the political system, the economic system, are not produced by the political system or the economic system or the legal system, but rather they're produced by the family based on the marital covenant between husband and wife. And when that is compromised, when the marriage culture begins to erode, when marriage collapses in a community, we see very well the consequences. We've had enough experience in this late season of our time on this planet. We have enough experience with family breakdown, failure of family formation, sexual anarchy, out-of-wedlock childbearing, to know that the true victims are the children who, in those circumstances, are doomed, or virtually doomed, to a life of delinquency, despair, drug abuse, criminality, violence, incarceration, in a vicious cycle. This is why we care about marriage. People sometimes ask me, well, look, even if you're right about marriage, this moral issue, as they put it, of marriage, even if you're right about that, why do you spend all your time on that issue? I mean, why don't you leave that issue alone for a while and concentrate on, say, fighting poverty? And I say to my friends, you really don't get it, do you? You don't realize that marriage is the greatest anti-poverty program that was ever created. In fact, it is so central to enabling people to live in dignity, to avoid the collapse into poverty, to rise out of poverty where they are experiencing poverty, that one almost would be tempted to think that it's no mere human creation.
Now, some people might agree even with that second point you make and say, well, look, here we are today, a dysfunctional marriage culture that, absent miracles, isn't going to change very fast. It's not going to get better very fast. What can we do in the meantime? How do we live in the meantime? How do we work for justice in the dark ages that may be lying before us?
Well, first of all, I believe in miracles. So our first obligation, I think, is to pray. We know there are real victims of the collapse of the marriage culture. There are real victims of what might be called the war on the family, the misguided war on marriage and the family. And for the sake of those victims, we should be on our knees before God, asking for His blessing, never supposing that there's nothing that He can do. And at the same time, being willing to be His instruments in the cause of rebuilding the marriage culture. We desperately need to rebuild the marriage culture. We need a vibrant marriage culture. The collapse was swift. It's always a lot easier and quicker to tear down than to build up. But with God's help, I still believe we can rebuild the marriage culture. So we will not have 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 generations being brought up in circumstances in which we have no functioning, vibrant culture of marriage. The other thing is we need to model strong marriages in our own lives. And we need communities that will put a premium on nurturing those marriages, supporting those marriages, enabling people to be good role models for their children and for all children of what it's like to be a husband, to be a wife, to be a father, to be a mother. We can do that. So we need to pray. We need to practice what we preach by being good role models. And we need to preach. Now, people don't like that. They say, well, I don't want to sound preachy. I don't want to condemn other people. I don't want to impose my values on others. Well, the prophets didn't worry too much about that. When they saw that justice was in the balance, they were willing to say what was on their minds. They were willing to speak truth to power. They were willing to speak truth to people who didn't want to hear the truth. And that's what we need to do, too. We need to be in the forefront, out there making the argument that marriage is the institution that brings together man and woman to be father and mother to any children born of their union, conferring on those children the inestimable blessing of being brought up in the loving, committed, covenantal bond of the mother and father, the man and woman, whose union gave them life, giving to those children the great blessing of paternal and maternal influences and care. That's the goal. We need to be about the goal. We need to talk about it. We need to act on it, act to build it. We need to model it in our own lives. We need to pray for it.
You've surprised people over the years with your friendship with Cornel West, who's associated with positions often quite different than the ones you've taken publicly. How can we seek to work for justice, for God's justice, across partisan divides, which have recently grown so deep in this country, seem to be deepening?
There is no bond between two people more powerful, in my opinion, than a shared love of truth, a shared desire to get at the truth. That will include the desire to be corrected when one is in error, because one must love truth more than opinion, than one's own opinions. My own mission, my own vocation as a scholar, and as a Christian, is to know the truth, is to get at the truth. And that means I need to avoid falling so deeply in love with my own opinions that I prefer them, even if erroneous, to the truth. And Cornel West sees his vocation as a scholar and as a Christian in exactly the same way. I love Cornell because Cornell's a lover of truth. We disagree about many things, as you pointed out, but that, in a certain sense, gets relativized. Yes, we have important differences, but they're relativized because the common ground that creates the bond of love between us is a love of the truth. Cornell wants to know the truth, and if he's in error, he wants to be corrected. I'm the same way. So when we debate each other, we know that neither of us is seeking a victory. Both of us are seeking the truth. The dialectical enterprise is really a cooperative venture in pursuit of a common good. Getting at the truth, understanding, knowledge, wisdom. We're in the truth-seeking business, in a kind of partnership. West and George, partners. Business, truth-seeking. Now, that doesn't mean we arrive at the same opinions. Sometimes we do, often we don't. But it means that we value each other